So now let's take an opportunity to look at explaining exactly what DISC is and also what DISC isn't. So the first thing we need to understand about DISC is that it's what we call a behavioural profiling tool. Now what that means is that it's assessing or measuring your behaviour in the context of your sport. Now the key thing about this is that behaviour is something that you can change, it's something that you can adapt. If you talk about personality, for example, this is one of the key ways that DISC is different to a lot of other tools, is that DISC is not measuring your personality. Personality is something which is inherent, intrinsic to you, it's more about who you are, whereas we're measuring how you behave. Now the key thing about this is that we're not asking you to change your personality as an athlete or a coach or a sports administrator. Like, your personality is fine the way it is. But there are times when your behaviour may not be giving you the outcomes that you want. So therefore, being aware of what your behaviour is enables you to make some changes, if you want to. And that's the key thing. You actually have to have an attitude where you'd like to do something different. Because remember, if you keep doing the same things over and over again, you actually will get the same results. And so DISC just gives you that self-awareness as to what your behaviours are, which is like your input, and then you can assess what your output is. Now if you want a different output, you have to change your input. Okay, so DISC is about behaviour. Okay, now the key to DISC is that there are 4 different styles. Now we have the dominance, the influence, the steadiness, and the conscientious styles. Now all of us, as human beings, to some degree or another, display these styles or behavioural patterns to a higher intensity or to a lower intensity. Now all of us have this to some level, but most of us will have a preference for 1 or 2 of these behavioural patterns more so than the others. And so what I'd like to do now is take you through what it means to be a D, an I, an S and a C. So now we're going to talk about what it means to be a D, an I, an S and a C. Now really there's 3 ways to understand DISC. You can look at, in your reports, in the back page, section 2 of your reports, it talks about the DISC theory and explains all of the different behaviours in a column sheet on page 28. But what we're going to refer to now is on page 19, and we're also going to link back to page number 5. And on page 5, it talks about the scales, and so what it means to be high in an area or low in an area. And so between page 5 and page 19, where you can see these graphs, we're going to talk about what it means to be a D, I, S and C. Before we do that though, what you'll notice is that you have 2 graphs. One of these graphs is called your graph 2, and that's called your natural style. Graph 1 is called your adapting style. Now this is one of the key ways that DISC is different to most other profiling tools. When we talk about your natural style, we're describing more about the true you. It's how you like to behave. It's called your default pattern of behaviour. It's quite likely how you behave when you're very, very comfortable in your environment, or it can also be how you behave when you're under a lot of stress and pressure. And the reason that is because when we're under stress and pressure, quite often we are not having the opportunity to think about what is the most appropriate behaviour, and instead we just revert to more instinctive patterns. Okay, so that's your natural style. Your adapted style is when you filled out the survey, you thought about how you behave in the context of your sporting environment. And so that created your adapted style. It's literally how you feel like you behave in this environment here, knowing that you actually may behave a bit differently in another environment. If you can see these 2 graphs I'm holding up here, you can notice that there's a fair degree of similarity between both graphs. Now what that tells me is that this individual is not making massive or large adaptations, so that is contortions or changes in their behaviour from who they naturally are when they go to work in their sporting environment. Now the benefit to that is that when an individual is not changing themselves a great deal, it means that they're bringing most of their natural strengths to the sporting environment. Now the issue when you're making an adaptation, so this individual makes a little bit of a shift in their D score, what that means is that they're changing themselves in some way. Now when you change yourself or make an adaptation to your behaviour, it comes at what we call an energy cost. It means that you actually have to think, well, I'd like to do this, but I'm going to do this instead, because in this environment, maybe you've worked out that that behaviour is not going to give you the outcomes that you want. So now we're going to take an opportunity to look at what it means to be a D. Now, essentially when we look at your graphs, I always refer to your natural style first. So when we look at our D behaviour, you can go back to page 5, but essentially the D scale from low to high is all about how you deal with issues, challenges, situations and confrontations that you experience, problems, stuff that goes on in your life, from a large scale all the way down to a very small scale. And so what we're suggesting is that someone who is a high D, they like to deal with their issues, challenges, problems, situations and stuff that goes on in their life in a very direct way. And what that means is that if they see a problem, they like to fix it immediately. So they don't like to leave that problem linger and potentially blow up into an even bigger issue. Now that has its benefits, because if that problem needs to be fixed immediately, Ds are very good at doing that. But if the problem is often more complex and perhaps doesn't require an immediate solution, having a very direct approach can often create a poor outcome, because the solution was not well thought through and potentially you haven't discussed it with anyone else. Now a low D on the other hand, so someone that scores between 20s to 30s to 40s on this scale, they deal with their problems very indirectly. And so that means that they will discuss it, they'll think about it, they'll plan, they'll go away and they'll actually decide on a course of action, which eventually they'll put into practice. Now once again, if the problem is complex, if they have the opportunity to think about it, if they do have the time to act instead of it being an urgent problem, they can often get very good outcomes from that. Some other qualities of the high D. So when I'm talking about high or low, high scores around the 80s and above, moderate scores 60s to 80s, low scores below 40. So when we're talking about the high D, the other way that they behave in the context of sport is that they're very, very results driven. They like to win, they're very competitive. And so when they turn up to play sport, their priority is literally to create outcomes, to gain results and to create winning results. And so what that means is they'll often compromise other factors such as relationships, maybe even technique. For them it's more important to achieve an outcome than it is to do it the right way. And so what we're going to do next is talk about the I's. So what we're going to talk about now is the I profile. Now this is the influencing scale. So once again you can refer back to page 5 where it will give you a description as to what that I scale is. But basically if you look at this graph here, you can see that this individual has a lot of similarity between their natural level of I and their adapted level of I. Now basically what the I scale is from 0 all the way through to 100, if you're above 50, it means that you're more extroverted with your behaviour, and if you're below 50, it means that you're more introverted. Now the difference between introversion and extroversion. Introversion and extroversion is all about where you get your energy from. So most of us, you can think about people like being a 12-volt battery. It's literally what recharges and what de-energizes that battery. For an extrovert, things that energize them is being around other people, being social in their environment, talking to others and interacting in a fast-paced, dynamic, changing environment. Whereas for introverts, it's the complete opposite. Introverts enjoy their personal space. After they've been coaching or associating with fellow athletes and team members all day long, they actually enjoy the opportunity to close their door, have their personal space to recharge their batteries. They often listen more than they talk, and quite often they have a more narrow focus of attention, whereas the I's tend to typically spread their focus of attention a little bit wider. Both have their benefits, but this is one of the key ways that we find that people are obviously different and can dramatically have a change on how you prepare for a match or a game. You'll often see the extroverts talking and chatting and being energized by the environment that they're in, whereas the introverts like to prepare by being quiet, not talking as much. They don't like to celebrate to the same degree that the higher I's do. Okay, so from the scale of 0 to 100, if you're above the 50 mark, once again, you sit on the scale of being more extroverted, and if you're below the 50, you sit on the scale of being more introverted. So now we're going to look at the S scale. So once again, refer back to page 5 if you like. Basically the S scale here, and you can see this from 0 to 100 once again. This person's level of S doesn't shift much between their natural and adapted style. Basically, the higher your level of S, you can think of the S as the pace scale. So that's how quickly or slowly you like to interact with the environment that you're in. So someone that is scoring high in their level of S, and once again a high score is 80 and above, they're more slower paced, they're more relaxed, they're more considered with how they do things. So you can consider in the context of making a decision, someone who's a high S is more likely to approach that in a very indirect way they're more likely to take their time to process the information that they have available to them, and in their own time come up with a solution, and it's usually going to be a quality solution because they've taken the time to process and think about different outcomes and solutions along the way. Someone who's a low S, so particularly those that score below 20, they're actually very fast paced, so they have a high sense of urgency. They'll measure basically their output by literally how much they get done during a practice session. Coaches that are low S, they always feel the need to change things. Okay, so they like a very dynamic, changing environment which is marked by variety. That's the complete opposite for a high S. A high S is also the profile which we associate with being the most team-oriented. And what we mean by that is that they naturally think team first. So they're very selfless with their behaviours. For them to put the team in front of themselves is natural. Whereas we're not saying that low S's can't be team players, we're just saying that they're a little more individualistic with their focus. Now we're going to explain a very important concept once we get to the C's, and that is how we achieve the behaviour that we want from a completely different profile. Because what we're going to learn is that any profile can behave the way that we want them to, but their motive for doing so is going to be potentially vastly different. But that's what we'll talk about when we look at the C's. So now we're going to look at the C profile, which is the conscientious style and the final letter in the DISC model. So once again, page 5 will talk about this as well, but on a scale from 0 through to 100, the C scale is the degree to which you will or will not follow rules, systems, processes and procedures and structure. Someone who is a high C is going to follow rules, they're going to stick to the systems, they're going to stick to the structures. Now in the context of sport, you can think about rules, systems, structures, procedures as being game plans, tactics, strategies, technique. Team rules as well, codes of conduct. Okay, now someone who is a high C is usually very structured. So a coach that's a high C usually spends a lot of time detailing the intricacies of the session, what drills are going to be done, why those drills are going to be done, and organising the environment so it can happen as efficiently and as effectively as possible. Now, if you're lower in the level of C, this is one of the areas where most people make an adaptation. As a coach, as an athlete, as someone who goes to work in any corporate environment, most people adapt their level of C up because most environments demand that we're organised, we're well structured, and we of course follow certain rules. Now, someone who's a low C is less rule governed. That basically means, it doesn't mean they won't follow the rules, but they tend to see rules as being more of a guideline. Perhaps rules are meant to be broken. That's what they'll actually suggest as an extreme version of that. But here's where DISC is really useful. Just because someone is a low C does not mean they won't follow the rules, but it will mean that their motive for doing so is entirely different from someone who's actually a high C. Someone who's a high C, they see a rule and they follow it because it's a rule. Someone who's a low C, they can still follow the rules, but we refer to another aspect of their profile to find out why they're following the rules. So if you just say to them, look, you have to do this because it's a rule, to them that's not really going to make sense. It's not a compelling enough reason to do so. But what if they're a high D? So before we talked about the high Ds as being results focused and really primarily interested in creating winning outcomes. So to get a high D to follow the rules, especially if they're a low C, we need to pitch it to them in such a way that these strategies, this tactic or this technique is going to help you go faster, it's going to help you produce better outcomes, it's going to help you win. Now if we pitch it to them in that way, it becomes more compelling. But that's tapping into their unique level of motivation, their reason for wanting to do it. Now if they're a high I, like this profile here is, one of the qualities of a high I, because they're extroverted, they like people to like them. And so a high I will follow the rule because they don't want to stand out from the group and not be liked by others. They don't want to have people say bad things about them. And so I's will follow the rules because they want others to appreciate them and they like the status that goes with that. And that's fine. And S is different again. Before we talked about the S as being team-oriented, selfless. And S will follow the rules because it's the right thing to do for the team. And so you can think about that in the context of the same way that we talk about the D's being the profile that may naturally gravitate towards a leadership position, for example, always wants authority, wants to win. It doesn't mean that the other profiles don't want to do those things as well, but their motive for doing so is very different. So that's a little bit of an insight into what the scales of DIS and C mean. And as we discuss this further, especially in our one-on-ones, we'll be looking at the adaptations that you make and discussing that in more detail.